Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Critical Conversations, where we discuss hot topic issues related to the Muslim world. Today we will talk about growing concerns surrounding terrorism here in the US. To help us understand the evolving nature of the threat and what law enforcement is doing to prevent these attacks from taking place, we are joined today by two FBI agents. Robert Lewis, who is with the Western Massachusetts Joint Terrorism Task Force, and Julia Crowley, who is supervising special agent with the FBI. They are both based in Springfield, Massachusetts, and we are very pleased to have them on the show. Thank you both so much for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Welcome. So Rob, let me start with you. After the attacks in San Bernardino and Paris, Americans are generally quite afraid. There was a poll conducted by the New York Times and CBS in December 2015, which showed that 63% of Americans were extremely concerned about terrorism, and about 44% said that they felt there was a terrorist attack that will take place in the next few months. So what is federal law enforcement doing? What are local law enforcement agencies doing to prevent these attacks from taking place?
Well, since 9/11 and even before 9/11, the FBI and federal law enforcement in general has taken national security very seriously. Any threats that we receive, no matter how slight or how serious, we follow up on all of them. We use different levels of investigation depending on the seriousness of the threat, and it requires a lot of manpower. And thousands of agents around the country are working various levels of threats at any particular time. Any threat that we get, no matter how insignificant it may seem, is followed up on in some way, and that is what people are doing full time around the country.
And you are with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Now, is that something in Springfield? Is that something that cities around the country have?
Yes. Most major cities around the country have a Joint Terrorism Task Force, and the agents would investigate any of the threats that come in that region of the country.
Right. And so, Americans, how do you allay those fears that people have just generally, walking into a building or going to holiday parties or to the mall, that something like this would not happen? How do you, as federal law enforcement, alleviate those concerns?
Of course, nothing's 100%, but I would say that the people that I've worked with over my 26 years are very dedicated people. The agents that I've been able to work with, and they are very dedicated people, and that every threat that we get, we take seriously, and we work until we've alleviated the threat. And whether that be something very insignificant that we just determine is, the information is bad information, or whether it goes to a level where we need to, prosecute someone ultimately.
And you feel like you have the required support by the institution, by your institution, in terms of funding and resources to be able to carry out your work effectively?
Absolutely. Yes, I do.
Great, excellent. Well, since 9/11, there's been a concerted effort by federal and local law enforcement agencies to reach out to American Muslim communities and do outreach and sort of become partners with them in trying to identify radical elements within those communities. And my question is, how has that outreach effort gone? What are some of the successes, and what are some challenges and opportunities surrounding those outreach efforts?
Outreach, to me, is extremely important for a variety of reasons. The big reasons being so that the law enforcement people, whether it be local, state, or federal, that are investigating any level of crime, understand the communities where they're working, and understand the people that they're trying to protect, and understand cultural differences. And vice versa, for the communities to build up some level of trust for law enforcement that needs to exist for a better understanding of each other, so that everybody can the cases can be investigated properly and thoughtfully, and at the same time, the public can trust law enforcement enough to that they can go to them when they need help.
Sure, sure. And, you talked about trust, and I feel like that is very critical in sort of building that relationship. And, when you hear about cases in other parts of the country about surveillance and informants and sting operations sort of associated with the FBI, that tends to undermine your efforts, like, so right here in Springfield. And, I know as a member of the American Muslim community here that you all have just done amazing work in sort of trying to work with the community and build that level of trust. But how do you then try and sort of salvage that when when communities then hear about other operations in other parts of the country, which sort of undermine that trust, like due to surveillance and sting operations and stuff?
Right. I mean, investigations inevitably are going to happen based on events that happen around the country and around the world. That's not really something I could comment on, except I know how Julie and I have worked in this area to build up relationships. And I know what's happening around the country. As far as the negative influences, there are cases that are prosecuted that there's strong public opposition to, in various areas. The one thing I would say is that I know that efforts are being made like ours all around the country to varying degrees. And I would say that the FBI in general is trying to do these outreach efforts in a different way, I think, than probably happened back in the 60s and 70s. I think the attitude is more, this is not an intelligence gathering, this is more of actual community outreach to build relationships for all the reasons I talked about earlier, for the education of for us as law enforcement, and to build that trust for for those reasons. Not just here, but a lot of other places. I can't really comment on the other areas of the country.
Sure. And how do you think the Muslim community has responded to that? Are they tentative? Are they more, are they also forthcoming? Are they, how has that been for you?
For me, it's been great. Julie, you want to?
I agree. There has been, and I think part of it is our approaches when you talk about surveillance and secretive tactics. We've been very careful not to engage with the community without being invited, because some people might distrust our motives. So we wait to be invited, and when we are invited to the community events, as you know, we love to be there, we love to come, we love to speak to people, build up that trust. And I think when they know what to expect from us, they know we're not going to surprise them. They know that we're not there to trick them. We're there when we're invited, and we're very appreciative of being invited. That they're very welcoming. They've been very helpful, and I think, as you know, and you've been dealing with us now for many years, Rob, for several years. You know that you can trust us, and when you come to us with an issue or a problem, we're there for you. We will help you and talk with you, and vice versa. And we do that out in the open with you in your community and your events, and I think that has really solidified our relationship with the community.
Absolutely, and I don't know whether I can go into a lot of detail about this, but I would like to sort of mention here that, every time there has been any kind of threat to our mosque or to our community, the FBI has, they've just been amazing in responding very, very quickly and addressing our concerns, and so that's something that doesn't always make the news, or it's not out there, but it's something that I feel like really needs to be acknowledged.
And that's and there's a reason it doesn't make the news. We do respect people's confidentiality. If somebody comes and expresses a concern to us, and it doesn't matter who it is, we keep their confidentiality. I assure you, we handle it. But we try to be very careful to protect people, so that they do feel like they can come to us and tell us things and not be exposed and not have to worry about any retribution of any sort. So you won't see things in the news, and a lot of times you may not hear anything else about it, but we let you know it's been handled and everything's safe.
Absolutely.
So
Great. Well, thank you for that. So according to a recent study by the New American Foundation, since 9/11, white supremacists and anti-government groups have killed more people than have terrorists who are Muslims. And it's not a big difference. There are about, since 9/11, about 48 deaths that are attributed to far right-wing terrorist groups and about 45 to Muslim groups. So how is federal law enforcement tackling this threat sort of emanating from the far right-wing groups that we don't often hear about?
We have agents around the country dedicated to both, whether we call it international terrorism or domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism in some, the FBI considers to be not necessarily right-wing, but many of the groups are right-wing groups. There are sometimes left-wing groups like animal rights extremists and things like that. But we do have a segment of our terrorism investigators working on those cases, and I can say that we've worked on cases like that in Massachusetts. We've prosecuted people that were involved in that over the last 10 years. A good example of the resources that the FBI is dedicating to domestic terrorism right now would be the standoff in Oregon. I mean, hundreds of agents there now from all around the country working to hopefully end that situation peacefully. Sure. Unfortunately, there was an incident that happened last week there, but that's an example of how resources can be allocated for what people would consider either right-wing extremists or domestic terrorists without any hesitation. The way I think the FBI looks at it and the way we look at it is we try to help with any threat, depending, it doesn't really, it matters in the end, it doesn't matter to us what we classify it as. If it's a threat and it happens to be a domestic terrorist threat or a hate crime threat or an international terrorism threat, we dedicate resources to it. We worry about how it's classified later, and the media worries about it, and other people worry about it. We see it as investigators as a threat, and other people classify it for us after.
But the amount of resources that are allocated to a particular threat, doesn't that depend on how it's classified? So if it's a domestic terrorist incident, that might be classified slightly different, or resources dedicated to it in a slightly different fashion than to a random, say, shooting. And you said that different communities take that seriously to different extents, and so within the Muslim community, that's like a big thing. Why is one thing domestic terrorism and another is not? So how do you define domestic terrorism, and does the FBI have a definition of domestic terrorism?
And I can't quote the exact definition here, but the FBI would consider domestic terrorism to be groups inside the United States with no foreign nexus, with no foreign influence, just a U.S., and again, it could be right-wing or left-wing, it could be animal rights extremists, could be sovereign citizens, it could be militia extremists, or other special interest groups that have gone to an extreme to use force or violence to affect change.
Right, and so even say a terrorist who's Muslim and who is not directly connected to, say, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but is inspired by them, would that be that would be domestic terrorism, though?
It depends.
Or would it be international terrorism?
It depends. There are cases that are being, and I don't want to start
Sure.
speaking as a prosecutor because I'm not a prosecutor, but there are cases that are being seen around the country where individuals that are inspired by groups overseas are considered international terrorists in some cases, depending on that how it came about.
Sure, okay. And so then do you also do outreach efforts in communities where, far right-wing groups proliferate or are? Do you sort of do that in order to identify them and sort of prevent things from happening, as you do with the Muslim community?
We do a lot of outreach in rural communities with schools, with police, with or it could be educational institutions like colleges, a lot of outreach, or churches. We do outreach with a lot of different denominations.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. After the attacks in Paris and after the attack in San Bernardino, anti-Muslim sentiment went up considerably here in the U.S. Research shows that it's not just after incidents of violent extremism that Islamophobia goes up, but also in election years. And we are in an election year, and we've had sort of leading presidential candidates sort of speak, vitriolic rhetoric against Muslim communities and stuff. And so, according to FBI stats, prior to the attack in Paris, there were about 12.6 attacks per month against Muslims. And since then, that has sort of trebled. And so what is federal law enforcement doing to ensure that American Muslim communities are also protected and their places of worship are secure?
I want to kind of comment on the statistics.
Sure.
Anytime we have an incident like that makes the national news, and it's horrific, we do see a spike in certain types of either whether they're hate crimes or hate incidents. Sure. And what I mean by hate incidents are expressions of hostility that don't necessarily break the law. So we will see a spike in that. What we try to do is we try to immediately reach out for communities, make sure is everything okay, make sure that they know that we're here for them, because we vigorously investigate hate crimes. It's very important. It's one of our priorities in the FBI. So we're always there. But again, when those statistics spike after these incidents, and typically they tend to drop again, but we increase our efforts for outreach. Because we know that that's going to happen, and we know that a particular community that might be being portrayed in the media not as favorably, we know that they're probably nervous and concerned and worried, and so we want to make sure that they know that we're here, and it's just, again, increasing our efforts of outreach. And, because we do so much outreach with the various communities, we have those people we can immediately go to. Right. And they can come to us, and we can identify where any concerns are, where any issues are. Are there any threats? Are there any incidents of hate crimes? We did see, even in our own community here, a spike in what we would consider hate incidents. It was minor, but we saw it. And we handled it and dealt with it, and made sure that those hate incidents weren't going to escalate to hate crimes or any kind of acts of violence. So, again, the FBI just takes these hate crimes very seriously. It is one of our #1 priorities in the criminal cases that we investigate.
Absolutely. And so suppose there is a threat against a mosque or a place of worship. Who would they contact first, or who should they contact first? Should they contact the local law enforcement, the police station, or directly the FBI?
I would recommend, especially if you think it's imminent violence, that you contact your local police department. If it's something that you don't believe to be imminent, contact who you're comfortable contacting. I think I know here in Western Mass, all the local police departments have very good relationships with the different community members. So I would always recommend you call who you're comfortable calling. But anytime it's, you think something is imminent, an imminent danger, call 911, call your local police department. We're always available as well. The FBI, if you have other concerns, you can contact our office, the FBI, myself or Rob, or any other FBI agent you may have come to know over the course of living in this community.
Sure, that's very, very helpful. We've seen so many incidents of mass shootings around the country over the past few years, and a lot of them are, whether we classify them as terrorists or not, are done by individuals who have mental health issues. I personally feel that even a terrorist has mental health issues. That's why they, sort of took that path, in addition to other things. But if within a community, whether it's a Muslim community or the community at large, if a parent or a teacher or a community worker sees a young person who seems to be having mental health issues or is just seems a little bit off, what would you recommend in terms of for the parents of that individual? Should they call the police? Should they alert the police or the FBI or the psychiatrist? I mean, how is a parent to know where on the spectrum their child is? Is he just being a teenager, or is he, seriously contemplating something difficult? Because parents have that concern. Well, if we tell on him or her, what if they're arrested? So what would you recommend?
I can comment generally on what we're seeing. I think nationally, a lot of incidents with the rise in concern about terrorist incidents. We're getting a lot of information about that involves people with mental health issues. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we've tried to do here is try to, if there's no crime that's been committed, we try to engage the person using whatever means we can with mental health professionals. Uh-huh. Many people don't want professional help, and in many cases you can't make them get professional help. Right. We've tried working with local law enforcement, and we've done a lot of outreach with mental health professionals throughout the state. Mm-hmm. To try to develop a similar trust in that regard, because there are a lot of medical issues that there's a privileged relationship there. So we're trying to develop a lot with mental health professionals and law enforcement to try to have an avenue where if we have an issue or a potential threat and there's no and there's not a crime, then right. There's really nothing more for us to do. But we can't turn our back on it. We sure. have to do something. And what we are trying to do as law enforcement is steer that person to some sort of help that can help them before they do something violent.
Right. And so do you think that's there's been a shift in the way the FBI itself works? First, there was I'm assuming primarily a law enforcement sort of component mm-hmm. to your work, but now it's more sort of holistic in that you also, take in, sort of refer people to, mental health professionals. And is that something that's changed over the years for you because of the evolving nature of the threat, perhaps?
I would say yes, and I think mm-hmm. it's just that I think just in general we've come to realize that the solution isn't to arrest somebody. Mm-hmm. The solution is to try to help them and prevent any crime or any act of violence. And so our goal when we hear of a concern of an individual, ultimately what we like to do, not just the FBI but local law enforcement, is to find a person that can sort of what we would call the pulse taker of the individual. Make sure that if anything seems off or goes wrong, or they seem to be headed down a path where they're not maybe doing so well, that we have someone that is in contact with that individual and can let the police or law enforcement know, and then we can kind of come back out and revisit it. And it's sometimes with certain individuals who do have mental health issues, it is just a constant team effort mm-hmm. to make sure that they stay okay. Right. And it's something it's like Rob said, we can't ignore it, but it's something we have to constantly monitor. And the goal of monitoring, again, is not to arrest them and put them in jail if they haven't committed a crime, but it's to make sure that they don't. Mm-hmm. And it's to make sure that they are safe and that their family's safe and the community's safe. And it is a constant process. And it's just it's a team effort amongst family members, law enforcement, mental health professionals, friends and family of the individual, co-workers of the individual. It's just a team effort. A lot of times once you recognize that there might be an issue and there's intervention, it's very successful in preventing potential. I mean, again, it's hard to measure what's prevented or not prevented, but it has shown to be a successful process of intervention and keeping someone kind of in when I say in line, I mean making sure when they become troubled or their mental health starts to decline for whatever reason, we get there and there's a support group and we help them, we get them back in line so that they aren't at a risk for anyone.
Sure. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. It seems that, sort of based on the statistics that we had sort of mentioned earlier about, concerns people have about terrorism, and just general, there's been so many incidents of mass shootings, it feels like no place is safe anymore. Whether it's a movie theater or a classroom or a holiday party, nothing seems to be completely safe. So if people find themselves in a situation where there is a mass shooter and there is an active shooter situation, what would you recommend to ordinary, citizens? How should they react? Should they run? Should they try and tackle the person? What should their strategy be?
First of all, we understand the concern, and some of it, unfortunately, is driven by the 24-hour news cycle, and it amplifies kind of these incidents that are happening. I'm not downplaying them because they're horrible, and these incidents are happening frequently. But the chances are small. However, if it's something that I'm concerned about as a citizen as well. If you end up in a situation like that, for most schools have plans in place and they work with the local police. Most corporations or companies or things like that. Places of worship may or may not have that, and it may not be something that they've thought about before, just as well as any other, maybe a small business or something like that. And what I would recommend is for those places to have a liaison with their local police. Talk to their local police. In some cases, I'm sure the police would be willing to come out and walk around and talk with you about a plan, whether it be a written plan or an unwritten plan. Having a plan is, I think, the most important thing. Unfortunately, I even think about it when I go into a mall or into a theater. You think, because of these things have happened. Where are the exits? Those types of things. Always, and I don't, not to generate paranoia, because I don't think that's helpful, but I think to generate an awareness of your surroundings wherever you are. And in many cases, unfortunately, in a mosque or a church or a business, there should be ahead of time either a written plan or something that's been talked about among the staff at those places.
That's really good advice, because I don't feel like, especially places of worship, whether they're churches or mosques or synagogues, they don't really think about that, but there've been so many, with Oak Creek at the Sikh temple a few years ago, and Charleston last year. You worry about those things, and you're right. So I think that's a really good thing to sort of alert people about that they should do. But and suppose at a mall, if ordinary citizens, if they know there's an active shooter, what should the strategy be? I mean, how should we run? Should we hide? Like, what would you recommend?
I think it's hard to recommend a specific course of action without, every situation is going to be different. It's going to depend on the offender. It's going to depend on who the victims are as well. I kind of equate it to if you're attacked by somebody. In some cases, fighting that offender, fighting back, will be productive, and in other cases, it could end up being the wrong thing to do and could get you even more injured. So it's hard to know. Do you run? Do you fight? It's really, I don't think we're able to give an answer of what the best thing to do is each and every time. Some circumstances will, running will be the most effective course of action to saving lives. In some cases, hiding. In some cases, possibly confronting the offender. But again, it's just going to be dependent on the situation, the location, how many people are present, what weapons does the offender have, what's the mental state of the offender. Are they somebody, when you confront them, they're going to back right off, and you're going to be able to take control of that offender? Or is it somebody, is when you confront them, that just makes them more angry?
Sure. So there's no general advice as such. It's just
I don't think we could.
specific.
I don't think we can give it. I think.
Sure.
I think what Rob mentioned, having a plan in place and in mind is good because it gets people to think about it.
Right.
But I think when you have that plan in mind, you also have to remember that that could change depending on the situation. So don't just get fixed into a plan.
Sure.
Follow it if it makes sense. In some cases, that plan may not make sense. But I think always having the plan, practicing it, just like we have fire drills in every office building and school and various facilities have fire drills. But sometimes, the fire may not the exit may not be available to you, so you have to change that plan.
Absolutely.
So again, there's no one specific answer, and I think that can be disconcerting to people. But just when something like that happens, try to be very observant and assess the situation and figure out, do I follow the plan or do I have to deviate due to the circumstances around me? But I don't think sometimes you ever know how you're going to react until you're in that situation. It's hopefully something that people never encounter. And it's so unusual in our lives that again, you just don't know what to expect or how to react.
Well, that's excellent advice. Thank you so much, both. We're almost out of time, but I really appreciate your time and all the wonderful advice you gave us and gave us a lot to think about. So thank you so much. Until next time, this is your host, Mehlika Sandani.